The bandsaw is one of the most versatile machines in the shop that is indispensable when it comes to working with wood of any kind. Some have called the bandsaw one of the most important tools that you should buy before you buy anything else. Patented and named in 1808 by William Newbery of England, the machine design was nothing more than a pipe dream. The concept of using a tooth band spun between two wheels worked exactly as it had been designed, but the only real problem that plagued the idea was the blade itself. The archaic methods used to make the bands was problematic as blades were prone to breaking. 38 years later, Anne Crepin of France designed a method of brazing the bandsaw ends together. At nearly the exact same time, a method by steel makers was developed for rolling spring steel. Both of these breakthroughs together were enough to take the bandsaw blueprint and make it fully possible. By 1860, the bandsaw was perfected to a point where it could be depended on for everyday operations. Let me show you 10 quick tips that I use in my shop when I need to use William Newbery and Anne Crepin's idea to cut stock. Like my last full-size tip video, I've indexed each of the tips so that you can easily move on if you've already seen the tip. I've also got links you'll find in the description that go along with the video. Let's go.
There is a flame that burns inside myself.
In the next 60 seconds, I'm going to show you how to solve basic blade drift problems on your bandsaw. First, let me quickly explain what blade drift is. I've set my bandsaw fence a ½ inch away from my blade. As I cut, the blade is drifting towards the fence. Actually, this is very irritating. My bandsaw actually came with a method to correct this, which is an adjustable bandsaw fence. But if you really want to fix it, open the idler wheel compartment and look at the blade on the wheel. You'll want your blade to be directly in the center. To center it, turn the tracking knob and use a ruler, measuring both sides until the blade is equally spaced to the outside of the wheel. Now make sure your blade guides are set equally on both sides and your thrust bearings a paper's width away from the blade. Bottom wheel is not important. If your blade isn't sharp, you'll need to replace it. Make sure your blade is tensioned according to the manufacturer's recommendation, but that's it. Let's try it now. Bandsaws are relatively safe. As the blade moves, it pulls the wood downward and against the table. So long as the wood you're cutting is flat, the only real danger you should worry about is the spinning blade and your fingers. Enter dowels. Due to dowels having the ability to pivot forward, as they are cylindrically shaped, there's a very good chance that they can be ripped out of your hands, hurting you or permanently damaging your blade. But table saws and miter saws can actually grab onto dowels as well and send them flying. The truth is, bandsaws are probably the safest way to cut dowels, but you'll have to work with the laws of physics instead of against them. You'll need two 45-degree points of contact with the dowels, which will make it much more difficult for the dowels to spin forward. If you're interested in this much safer method, I have a set of free plans on my website that will show you how to make this simple jig with scraps you have lying around. If you're making repeated cuts with your bandsaw, the last thing you want to do is grab a tape measure every time to replot a measurement, especially with the chance you might mismeasure a section. Hey, it happens. You could always mark all your marks before cutting, but that's a rookie mistake and you wouldn't be taking the curve into consideration. How about using the fence as a reference point? This is another rookie mistake as the blade can bind. Instead, we'll use painter's tape. Start off by measuring your length on your stock. At the bandsaw, place the mark on the stock next to the blade. Due to even the tiniest thickness of the tape, we want to put it behind the stock we plan on cutting. From here, grab a pencil and carefully mark the tape at the end of the board. The same idea can be used for the table saw as well as the miter saw, just as long as you remember not to cut your stock on top of the tape. In previous bite sizes, we've talked about how safe bandsaws are as the blade pulls the stock downward. Kickback is rare to non-existent, and the only time I've ever felt like the bandsaw was pulling me into the blade was when I have foolishly tried cutting round shapes and had them yanked away from me. One of the dangers I dread that makes me jump, which is obviously dangerous, is when small pieces fall through the table. Bandsaws generally have two guides that keep the blade aligned. The upper one is of no consequence, but the lower one can be jammed with small bits of stock that's being cut, especially when there isn't a zero clearance insert in the table. You might rarely use your table saw to nibble away at things, but when you do, keep a stack of cardboard boxes on hand to prevent dangerous jump scares. Pasta, pizza, and cereal boxes are perfect as they aren't corrugated and lay flat on the tabletop. It doesn't take but a second to slide it on and another second to add a piece of painter's tape. See, Ma? Junk food has its perks. Bandsaws are extremely versatile machines due to the width of the blades that can be used. If I'm milling a log, I want the blade to be as wide as possible to prevent deflection. With narrower blades, like this 1/8 inch blade, I can easily cut the shape of a coin out. But if I try to use this blade to rip a piece of stock, the blade can wander as there are stresses in the wood. On the other hand, if I try to cut shapes with a wide blade, I can cause the blade to bind and even break. But you don't necessarily have to change the blade in the bandsaw if you need to cut a shape. Instead, we'll use relief cuts. Relief cuts release the blade from jams by taking the pressure off of the width, also known as the clearance of the blade. With shapes mapped and plotted, we'll trim our stock down to the pencil line before we go to the bandsaw. At this point, depending on the width of the blade, you'll have to decide how many relief cuts you'll need, but the rule of thumb is the sharper the radius, the more cuts needed. With the relief cuts made, instead of binding, our pieces will pop out, removing internal stresses that were created as we twisted our stock. The bandsaw is the only machine in the shop that's able to cut complicated 3D patterns like these handles, but they're really not difficult to make once you understand the process. First and foremost, anything cut on the bandsaw should be cut with a flat surface against the table. Trying to hold a piece of stock above the surface is a big no-no, as the stock will be pulled down and can twist. I'll start a safer method by adding my pattern to both the width and face of my stock. I'll cut the overall shape out on one of the edges. Once I've cut the edge that was the previous pattern, I'll use double-sided tape to reattach it. Now I can flip it again and cut my second drawn shape. When I'm done, I'll have a 4-sided object with 4 faces that are the same. If we look at my finished design, you can see that there's a large curve that's been cut out. I used a round shape to mark the curve and remove that shape next. I finished by cleaning it up on the sander. Cabriole legs are famously created in the same way. It's just a matter of planning the sequence of events before starting. If you're interested in this router handle build, you can check it out in the description. If you're looking to make complicated patterns with a bandsaw, like these plain knobs, but are worried that you don't have the skill to do it, they're very easy. The first thing we need to think about is how these guys will be glued together. From previous bite sizes, we've talked about end grain being the worst way to glue pieces together, so we'll start by making sure our grain is vertical. I've got 2 species of wood, ebony and purple heart, that I'll be interspersing between each other. I'll stack both pieces together with my darkest wood on the bottom, and use some heavy-duty carpet tape to combine the two. I'll add my pattern to the top piece and cut both pieces together. The most important step now is to make sure my bandsaw blade is at a perfect 90 with the table. Now I'll cut the pattern out by taking great efforts to make sure I'm making one straight cut. You can't nibble the line halfway through, it won't work. With all the pieces cut and arranged in the order that I started, I'll swap the pieces, adding glue to finish. As you can see, the grain is glued in a way that keeps the bond strong. These knobs work with a router plane I did a review for, but to see the full build of the knobs, I have a link in the description. Resawing lumber is incredibly taxing on bandsaw blades. The heat created from wider board cuts can quickly shorten their expensive lifespans. While choosing good blades like wood slicer blades have really helped due to their thinner kerfs, sawdust and heat are an unavoidable nemesis. I grabbed a great tip from Russ Vaynot a few years ago. Instead of relying on the bandsaw to cut the full width, I start with a table saw using a thin curved blade. You can grab one of these 16th inch blades for less than $10. And because they've got carbide teeth, they last a very long time. I make small passes, flipping my stock each time before bringing it back to my bandsaw. Now, not only do I have a great line to use to guide my cut, my bandsaw is doing the minimal amount of work needed to get the remaining width. This makes my bandsaw blades last much longer and puts more of the stress on the cheaper table saw blades that are better on the wallet. You will want to use either hand or machine planer, but even the cleanest bandsaw cuts need this anyway. If you want a longer explanation, go check out Russ's channel. I have a link in the description down below. As relatively safe as the bandsaw is, cutting small pieces can cause the hair to raise on the back of your neck. This might cause you to shy away from the bandsaw altogether, but there's a very safe way to cut small pieces that will keep your hair at bay. Instead of holding the piece you need cut with your fingers, transfer it to an inexpensive sacrificial board. Grab a piece of light-duty double-sided tape, and here's the real trick. Use a clamp to make the tape stick with an iron grip that won't allow the object to move as it's being cut, yet will allow you to remove it with a slight twist. As an example, I have a micro butterfly inlay that I want to cut out, but doing this with the bandsaw means taking a chance that one of these guys might not finish with your project. I've got a thin piece of cheap pine that I'll attach my stock to. I've placed the pattern as much as I can over the sacrificial stick using weak, double-sided tape. I'll make calculated cuts that will keep as much of the pattern stock on the stick at one time. I'll make mirror cuts, which will keep the pattern balanced and less likely to overturn. When it's done, cut the piece off to finish. Your fingers will thank you. When I made my bandsaw sled, it had to do a number of things. I made an arm with bearings that ride along a base. The base slides in my bandsaw's miter slot. This makes cutting small pieces easy as I can get closer to the blade, and my kerf is much smaller. I wanted it to cut circles, so I created an add-on that stacks on the base. It uses a window and a ruler to let me set measurements away from the blade. It cuts circles based on radius measurements that work off the base ruler, but I didn't want to always add a hole to every piece of stock I wanted round, so I added a turntable that I can add stock to with double-sided tape. What's nice with this jig is that I don't have to rely on thin blades to cut circles, but could instead use the miter slot to move the stock, which means I don't need to switch out my 3/4 inch blade each time. I used a circle protractor and made this jig that clamps to a T-track. If you're interested in any of these, I have 3 full step-by-step pages that will make cutting smaller pieces of stock easier. They're free and have both material and tools used. You can find it in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope that you got something useful for your shop. If you did, please leave me a comment below and let me know. A big thank you to my patrons that help to keep the bands moving in the shop. Thank you. Michelle B., Keith Current, William L. McNally, Jerry Adams, Tommy QR, Zach Finch, Rich Lightfoot, and Tudor the Barbarian. Hit the thumbs up, subscribe, and ring that bell. And I thank you so much for being a part of my shop. Please leave a comment below. Come find me on Instagram at Make Things with Rob. And remember to keep making things.
Like me, there is a flame that burns inside myself.